it that Elon Musk wants Twitter? Does it make business sense, first off?
It doesn't make business sense, no. Everyone thinks that they can unlock the, quote, real value of Twitter. And as we said, if Twitter didn't exist, you'd need to invent it. It's the world's news wires. It's the place where you go when news is breaking. It's the place where you find things out. But the problem is that in advertising terms, it's a very poor third to Google and to Facebook. So he admitted in a discussion with Chris Anderson of TED Talks just the other day that he doesn't think he would be able to get all that value out of it. But at the same time, he thinks that it's so important that he should take it private and do things with it, which seem to revolve around more free speech. But listening to him talk about those things with Chris Halligan, he didn't seem to diverge too much from what one would expect is actually going on already at the moment in Twitter.
For Elon Musk, it is largely about free speech. It's a trophy asset. It's about society rather than boosting his own already massive fortune.
Very much, yeah. He's a weird person in the sense that he's both very rational and very irrational. He tweets a lot, and sometimes it's a complete stream of consciousness, which you wouldn't be surprised to see from an 18-year-old. Other times it's very thoughtful and considering sort of big concepts like extraplanetary life and blockchain and how you could apply it to everyday life. So he's this strange mixture, and I think it's a mistake to try to think that you can understand whether he knows what his motives are. It's the sort of thing where he just gets up one day and says, I know, I'll buy Twitter. It seems like a good idea. And it's almost impulsive. But the fact is that by buying 9.2% of the shares, as he has done, he's effectively made its value go up because he is, as was said in the earlier package, he's an influencer. So he influences the price up. If he sells now, he's made a profit. And he might not get the Twitter that he wants, but it'll be a Twitter that is very happy to have him on because, rather like Donald Trump did, he pulls people in.
Very interesting. James Bohr, what do you make of this? Why do you think Elon Musk wants Twitter? Is it maybe just a speculative play, as Charles Arthur's just suggested?
Purely speculating here, but when someone's been charged by the SEC for securities fraud, for misleading tweet to manipulate a market, I'm sure that has nothing to do with why he wants Twitter. Along with accusations more recently of trying to manipulate cryptocurrency markets in a similar way, again through tweets. He's got this huge following, and anything that gives him more authority over that, probably appealing.
Ian Corby, let's come to you. Now, you're the Executive Director of Age Verification Providers Association. We've got the online safety bill coming up here in the UK next week, a very contentious bill. A lot of people think that's going to curtail free speech. If you're not a Twitter user, or if you just dabble, if you're just a regular person watching or listening to this discussion, why should we care who owns Twitter? Or should we?
Well, I think the most remarkable sort of headline-grabbing moment was really when Elon Musk said he wanted it to sort of reinvent Twitter's free speech credentials. And, Twitter's legal counsel used to say they were the free speech wing of the free speech party. So they were already a relatively liberal, unregulated, open forum. But they realised that was just leading to a lot of harms to their users. And so Twitter, even coming from that sort of philosophical position, have decided to put in protections for their users and to seek to reduce that level of harm. And my concern is that we're getting to a situation where the amount of protection that we offer, particularly kids online, is going to be down to the whim of a billionaire in Silicon Valley. And the great thing about the online safety bill is that it's going to set a level playing field, and it's going to allow Parliament to make the decisions about what is harmful and what is not, and what these platforms, particularly the very large ones, are responsible to do in order to protect kids when they're online, and in some cases adults as well.
So, Ian, let me get this straight. If this online safety bill goes through next Tuesday, we'll obviously be looking at it closely next week on GB News, and particularly here on The Money. Is there any way that lawmakers here can actually regulate what is a global platform like Twitter. Surely Twitter can still do what it wants. We're not going to block the whole of Twitter, are we?
Well, we learnt a lot when we were going to try to implement age verification for pornography previously, until the government got cold feet on that. And what we learnt was the only way you can focus the minds of these global platforms is hitting them where it hurts, in the pocket. And so the Online Safety Bill is coming with a lot of powers to intervene, not only to try and block sites and access to sites which are refusing to be compliant, but also to intervene on the services that support them, whether that's search services or payment services or hosting services, advertising platforms. All the things that make the commercial aspects of the internet operate can be used to put pressure on these platforms to come into line with UK law. Because while it is the World Wide Web, that doesn't mean to say that these companies don't have to comply with the democratic will of the British Parliament when it comes to obeying our laws when they're operating in this country.
Vicky Pryce, you've worked within Whitehall at a very senior level, regulatory bodies and so on. We're going to carry this discussion on after the break, and we'll talk about the online bill then. But just what's your opening response to this sort of battle for Twitter, this ongoing spat between Musk on the one hand and Zuckerberg on the other, and you've got somebody as well informed as Charles Arthur saying he probably doesn't even know what he wants to do with it?
I think the interesting thing is that there are more controls now going through various parliaments and the European Commission and so on in terms of what platforms like Twitter are allowed to do. So irrespective of what happens here in the UK, I think things are tightening up. So whether it's a privately held company, if that's what he wants to do, because he wants to take it, as you probably remember, it went public in 2013.
So his shares are listed on the stock exchange.
They are now.
He may want to delist it and hold the shares himself. Yes. Less scrutiny.
Absolutely. Less scrutiny in terms of what he wants to do with it, in terms of getting all sorts of things happening without needing to get a lot of shareholder approval. But at the end of the day, in terms of the output, it's still going to have to go through all sorts of regulatory sort of hoops, whether he likes it or not. That's how things are developing. And there is a lot of concern generally about how social media is being used right now. As you know, things are tightening up all around the world. But the interesting thing is what happens to companies like that. Twitter, as far as I can tell, only really made a profit, a small one, in 2018 and 2019, since it started existing. And this is a company which is still valued, as you were saying.
I don't get it.
Over £30 billion.
I don't understand where the value is. Obviously, it's got a huge... I tell you, let's ask Charles. Charles, before we go to the break, why is this thing... Of course, it's got an incredible database, hundreds of millions of users across the world. 20 million in the UK alone, lots of big data, so to speak. But I don't see that many adverts on Twitter. Maybe I'm not important enough to get all the adverts. I don't see where the revenue is going to come from. As Vicky Pryce says, it hardly seems to make any money. And yet it's valued at upwards of $40 billion.
A lot of Twitter's value, if we're talking about the actual inherent value of the service itself, comes from the fact that there are so many users on there, there are so many important users on there, there is such good transmission of information. As I said, if it didn't exist, you'd have to invent it, because it would be such a necessary thing in a world where the internet exists, where everyone has a phone, where they can send what's happening out into the ether straight away. You want somewhere that's going to effectively centralize it and then redistribute it. So Twitter has this enormous value as the newswire for the planet. So that's completely uncontentious, I think. That's what Musk sees himself as well. And that's what he said in this conversation with Chris Anderson. It's so valuable in that way. So your question is, why doesn't Twitter therefore have colossal revenues? It's because it's very bad at actually focusing on people and targeting adverts in the way that Facebook does or that Google does. Google gets the advantage that people come to it and do a search. Their search is the intent of what they want to buy, so they can target the adverts. Facebook builds up a profile of you. It knows what you want to do. But on Twitter, it's very poor at doing the profiling, and that's its weakness. If it was as good as Facebook is at doing the profiling, it would be rich. And Mark Zuckerberg, once called Twitter a clown car that drove into a gold mine. He said basically these people don't know what they're doing, and yet they're in the most fantastic place. And it's absolutely true. And people have said that if you could really unlock Twitter's value to people, that would be the way to go. One suggestion I've seen is that it should be subscription. I think that may be an Elon Musk suggestion. If you had to pay a subscription to use Twitter, you'd actually start to unlock that value, because you'd really see who wanted to be on there, and it would be all the newsmakers, the news takers, who would be on there in their millions.